Well, good evening and hello again from Bon Air First Baptist. I'm here with Bo Adams, one of the elders, and the preacher from yesterday, and Kenny Rogers, our senior pastor. And again, I'm Eric Pacheco moderating. Thank you to Dee Dee as she moderated for the last 2 weeks, and special Monday, as yesterday was Mother's Day, so we took the evening off for the mothers, and we're meeting on Monday night to discuss the Olivet Discourse. By way of reminder, chapter 21, we're in a series of chapters here, really the final week of Jesus on earth pre-crucifixion. Chapter 21 was the triumphal entry. Chapter 22, we went into the parables and debates with religious leaders as Jesus went into the temple there. Chapter 23, Jesus spoke to the crowds and levies woes upon the religious leaders. And then yesterday we started with chapter 24, the first part of the Olivet Discourse. We did the first 35 verses of that. And in this one, at this point now, he's speaking privately to his disciples. Anything you want to add by way of foundation as we enter this phase of your sermon and such?
Yeah, well, the only thing I would just emphasize again is it just really seems like the confrontations Jesus has been having with the religious leaders has built up, and with his woes announced to them in chapter 23, and then he kind of predicts in chapter 24 the outcome of it all. Again, sure. I believe he's vindicated in their attacks on him and their ultimate crucifixion of him, but he obviously holds them responsible for their rejection of him, and he prophesies the destruction that would come as a result, I believe.
Sure. So let's start right at the beginning. And chapter 24 there in verse 1, Jesus coming out, they're going away, and then his disciples come up to point out the temple buildings to him. Why do you think the disciples are pointing out the temple to Jesus as they're walking out here?
Yeah, you'd have to wonder because, I mean, obviously they've been there before, but maybe just annually, and so it's always a special occasion when they go, and maybe it was just some random comment that they made just in passing almost with regard to the majesty of the complex. But one thing, I read it in a commentary, and I can't remember which one, but somebody just wondered if it wasn't because of Jesus saying the house will be left to them desolate.
Sure.
And that just prompted them to wonder, well, how in the world this is such a majestic building and compound and complex and all, how could that be? And they maybe stressed that to him either for clarification or to see maybe what he would respond with.
Sure, it's been an interesting week. The cleansing of the temple, the confrontation in the temple, and then like you said at the end of chapter 23 there, he says, "Behold, your house is being left to you desolate." Any thoughts, Kenny?
I just had one.
Sorry.
I'm going to try to hold back on the original thought, though, to just comment on what Bo was saying. And this is, to go back and recap what he said from the sermon, this is the fifth discourse. It's the second to the longest, and it's just to the disciples. It begins in 24, and it ends in the first phrase of chapter 26, verse 1. But he not only goes out of the temple, and I don't know what every translation says, but the NASB says here, and was going away.
And was going away.
And you think about Ezekiel, from Ezekiel, the Holy Spirit leaving the temple. And I think the thought that I had is that it struck me when you said, okay, so he starts out the week cleansing the temple and all of this. I think that what we see here is that there is no reformation of the temple. It was not to be reformed. It is to be. Its job is over, and in a short time it will be dismantled.
And he certainly alludes to that. In verse 3, the disciples came to him privately saying, "Tell us when these things will happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age."
One more thing, I just thought about what he said too
in
the sermon. You know, to go back directly to your question, the disciples, they may be on the ascent now, and maybe they're looking down on the temple and they're thinking about what Jesus said, because he said your house is going to be desolate. And for them to ask the question, I mean, I think this is an aha moment for them in one of those rare times they have an aha moment when they get what Jesus is saying. The temple is going to be destroyed. Well, how could that be? Because Herod built this, and Bo went to great lengths to talk about that. And they not only burned it, they did They had slave labor throw those stones down into the valley below. I mean, it was a dismantling.
Yeah, in reference to his verse 2 prophecy.
Yeah, for the disciples that asked it, I mean, they're looking at this, and this is a huge complex, like a stadium complex, and it's going to be torn down.
So, and you, Bo, during your sermon, you even said you had some questions about the question. Do you think that they're equating the end of the age? What do you think they mean by the end of the age when they say, you know?
I mean, to me, it seems that they are equating, well, this is such a monumental thing, it has to be at the end of it all. But again, people I recognize have different views on that, and some would say, well, the end of the age is the end of the Jewish age, and now it's going to open the door to the Gentile age. But the disciples, I do not believe, would have recognized that.
Sure.
I mean, Paul describes that as a mystery that's been revealed, that God has opened the kingdom to the Gentiles. So I don't think they would have really received it that way. So I don't think they're asking as though just one chapter is closing, is ending, and there's a new one to begin. I think in their minds, it was so monumental that it signified the end of time, I guess.
So, what do you?
Or at least
what are your
the
thoughts,
Advent.
Kenny?
I think, and Bo pointed this out, and everything that I studied, and you look at the text makes perfect sense if you look at it this way. They ask two questions.
Yeah.
Throughout the discourse, he's going to give the answers to both those questions. And he concentrates on question number 1 first. When will these things happen?
Yes.
And then secondly, the end of the age question. And he takes those two things, and maybe in their mind, I think those two things are connected, but Jesus disconnects those two things.
Yeah.
But he didn't really clarify.
No.
Because obviously the end of what I had covered, I guess is verse 34, he says, in this generation. So if he just took it in two questions, when will this be? He could have just easily said, well, in this generation you'll see this.
Yeah.
And then go into the signs to come. But I don't know, he doesn't clarify it for them.
No.
And so therefore, as I said before, I don't think we should assume that it would be real clear to us.
Well, is there any chance that they still are wondering about the end of the age being the overthrowing of Rome or any sort of political victory?
I think so.
Yeah, so there still could be.
You know something else too, and this is not apocalyptic. It's prophetic, but not apocalyptic.
Sure.
He weaves in apocalyptic literature because he alludes to Daniel, but it's not apocalyptic. It's not.
Sure.
It's not secretive. And Bo did a really good job of, especially, I don't know if do you have a generation question? If you do, I'm going to hold.
Well, you know what? Yes, I do. Towards the end, as we get to because
I think generation is really important in this.
Sure. So we'll end on that since it's the last real verse that he talked about there.
Okay.
Anyway, and all this we talked about weaving in the apocalyptic and such. That's all I think fairly obvious after he starts his answer. But when they're asking, I'm not exactly sure where their head is. They might have gotten blown away by the depth of his answer. But
don't you think too? I mean, they reveal that when they ask a similar question in Acts just before the ascension. When's the end of the age? Yeah,
that's good. Well, as we go, so the next real chunk here, verse 4 through 14, it's really describing the birth pains leading to the end, right? And then he finishes with, this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. Is this literal in that when all the nations have had the gospel preached, the end will come? Or what does he mean by that? Is that one of the precursors to the end?
I'm not sure that this is end time to begin with.
Well, even if it's not, will whatever needs to happen only happen when that presupposition has occurred?
Yes, but it could still be imminent.
Okay, sure. And I get what you're getting at is that just because it may not have happened today, that doesn't mean it will not have happened tomorrow.
Right, and who's to be the judge of when that happens? That's my thought on it.
Any thoughts, Bo? And I guess this came to mind because I remember doing a tour of the Wycliffe Bible translators in Orlando, and this happened to be one of the verses that they had. kind of explaining one of the reasons that they were trying to translate the Bible into everybody's native languages. And so when you read it through that context, you're like, oh, okay, these guys are literally trying to make sure that this happens so that we're ready for the end of the age in one sense. And I'm not sure that that's, I might have been overreading that, but it just reminded me.
And if you connect that to a system, that best connects to a post-millennial kind of system.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a note that I just, for the sake of time, I still probably included more than I should have, but I had a note that I didn't mention, but it was about that, translations of the Bible into different languages and reaching different areas of the world. And one commentary I read compared how many languages the Bible's been translated in the turn of the 20th century, like early 1900s, to when he wrote his commentary, which was like near the end of the 1900s.
Yeah.
But even since then, it's been promulgated and just exponentially more. Right. Mm-hmm. And I didn't have I was going to research that because I heard somebody say something recently about that, and I was going to try to get that number, but again, it was just too much to include. But, having said that, I still wonder with verse 14 if it's still not a type of that it is I guess can still be an initial fulfillment and then an ultimate fulfillment.
Sure.
Because I think that's the story of Acts. I mean, Acts does kind of end abruptly.
You're right.
But it ends with the gospel being spread to the ends of the known world, the Mediterranean world, going to Rome. Yeah. And then soon after the Acts is concluded, then you have the fall of Jerusalem.
How many languages was the gospel translated into on the day of Pentecost?
On the day of Pentecost, sure, instantaneously.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great picture. Well, of course, this leads us to verse 15 with the abomination of desolation. So, what is this? And really, do we need to be looking for it, I guess, is the follow-on question.
Ooh.
Right. What is it in this context? I think, to me, and again, I'm probably simplistic in this, but when you compare the synoptics and you look at Luke's account, where it uses the same similar language, but Luke refers to when you see the surrounding armies or the armies surrounding Jerusalem, know that the end is near. I mean, to me, he seems to be equating the abomination of desolation with the Romans about to overthrow Jerusalem and destroy the temple. But again, that's not to say there cannot be a future fulfillment of that. And I know their views with regard to the Antichrist. But as John says, there have been multiple Antichrists at the time John wrote his letters. But again, I think it's probably ramped up at the end. There may be a premier or dominant Antichrist. But again, there were different, and again, I didn't include that just because there's not enough time to include everything.
No, it was a large section.
But I've read different views of what people held the abomination of desolation to be. But again, in my mind,
I'm not
it was
asking
just
specifically
simple.
so much as, so if we see something similar to the 70 AD scene in the temple, it's time to head for the hills. Is that what we're thinking?
Well, I kind of wonder that because to me, what would be the desolation? The temple is dismantled, it's over.
Yeah.
So what could there be that could be so, although I guess somebody's setting themselves up as Christ. I mean, that's an abomination. And that's ultimately, I guess, what the Antichrist is. And that kind of the equivalent of what Antiochus Epiphanes had done or what the Romans did. Maybe that's in the future what an Antichrist would do, just kind of try to take the place of, but again...
Of the Christ.
Right,
sure.
Right.
Kenny?
I think it clearly is a historical allusion here to the desecration of Antiochus Epiphanes.
Okay.
I certainly think that is the case. Happy Hanukkah, everyone. But
does it end there?
Well, it doesn't end at Hanukkah for sure. I mean, they're celebrating the purification of the temple after all that. But no, I think that is the, what shall we say, the benchmark of desolation. And the Romans, one of the things, and I'm sure you read this, Bo, was it was Tiberius They thought about raising a statue of Tiberius in the temple. You might have even mentioned that.
Was one.
Gaius,
Yeah,
that's right.
he might have preached on it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You mentioned it, and I saw it in the commentaries I was reading. And then ultimately, I think 70 A.D. And besides that, I guess the greatest desolation now, if Jesus is the final temple, which he is, then the greatest desolation is to do anything that is a desolation of Christ or his character. I think I would agree with Bo on that.
Yeah.
And people don't hear that, what Bo just said, but I think that's a really good thought.
Yeah, it makes sense for sure.
It does.
As we work towards verse 24 there, we have another very interesting, all these verses are interesting, but this one stood out to me. It says, for false Christs and false prophets will arise and will provide great signs and wonders so as to mislead, and then this is the part that I found interesting, if possible, even the elect. So does this mean that it will fool believers, or does it mean that the signs are so convincing that they would fool believers if it was possible, but it's not possible? What did you draw out of this section?
Well, to me, I guess the first fundamental truth to recognize it is not possible. If they are of the elect, then God will persevere them and they will be preserved till the end. But I guess he's just emphasizing how persuasive, I guess, these signs would be, that if something like that would be possible, then these signs would be that powerful or that persuasive or convincing, which is kind of disturbing on the one hand, but then encouraging in the fact that he, again, with it, still promises the elect will be preserved.
There is an encouragement in that, sure.
Right.
Kenny?
Absolutely,
yeah. And and that's what I saw in it as well, and I think it's easy to miss that encouragement in there if you read it in light of all the darkness.
With the great sign, these signs he's referring to, is it possible for somebody other than God to perform a miracle? And it makes me think of with Moses.
And that's the image that came to my mind, sure.
Right. Now, I don't know how many.
I think there can be counterfeit miracles, but only God can do the true miracles. Like Pharaoh's magicians can do the counterfeit miracles, but you kept using the word, I think it was in your sermon. Did you not use the word cosmic?
Yeah, cosmic phenomena.
Yeah,
just about
I think only God can do cosmic phenomena.
Sure.
And shake the world like this is shaken. And this great tribulation, this is a shaking. And everybody, when they see great tribulation, they think about the 7-year tribulation period. This is not talking about the 7-year tribulation period. This is talking about the tribulation that happens, that he points out in his sermon, that happens to Jerusalem during the siege, and Judea as well, but during the siege of the Romans, Tiberius. Yeah. And it was incredibly horrible. It was. Josephus writes about it, and it was horrible. This is the great tribulation that he's talking about here. Is the that period. Let's just read the Bible straightforward in the most natural way of interpreting it.
Yeah, and you preach that. Do you also espouse to the future potential tribulation as well, or is it we just end it there as it's written?
Well, I think that there's always going to be tribulation for Christians and persecution for Christians.
But that doesn't mean it's what he's talking about.
But that doesn't mean there's going to be a particular period of time when it ramps up. I think that things probably... I have this cyclical view of history, even of redemptive history. Things just kind of circle, and if you look at Revelation, it seems to me, and of course this is Hendrickson's view, but things between the seals, the trumpets, and the bowls, things are just ramping up. And I think that's happening through history, that these things are not sequential, but they overlap. So I just think that tribulation is there. It would be hard for you to tell people in the Middle East or in China where they're being persecuted that there's no such thing as a tribulation yet.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's go to the second half of that same verse, as we were in verse 29 talking about the tribulation. It also talks about the sun there. It says, but immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And in your sermon, you gave several great examples of the Old Testament that use this wording as figurative wording in other instances. But what are your thoughts? I mean, when you're preaching on this, I agreed with everything you said, but also came to mind some literal examples. One in Exodus, where the second to last plague, there was a thick darkness in all the land of Egypt for 3 days, and then, of course, it was followed by judgment. And then, of course, even in the book of Matthew, coming when Christ is on the cross, it'll say, now from the 6th hour, darkness fell upon all the land till the 9th hour. And so those are two literal examples of a darkness falling over a land just before a judgment being poured out. Any thoughts on correlation or?
Yeah, and I know when I kind of refer to that, it was more. It seems like it's certainly figurative language, but not that it couldn't be true.
Right.
I don't know what happened to Babylon, obviously, when
I wrote that down.
all that took place.
Yeah.
But having said that. We're talking about Josephus. In the Jewish wars, he gives an account, and I know people can question it, that there were cosmic things going on.
Yeah.
And whether that fulfilled this, that's another question.
Sure.
But yeah, I don't deny, or I wouldn't dispute that there very well could have been signs or something like that happened to a degree, but not literally as described in Isaiah, where they dissolve or fall to the sky. I mean, just like extinguished forever. And then maybe a picture of it.
Yeah.
And again, the question that just totally is from my mind and not scriptural is like, well, maybe all that is a picture of the future when literally
and
there's not going to be a sun.
Yeah.
And maybe that's just all kind of descriptive of the ultimate fulfillment of it. But yeah, I mean, that just leads me to the question, when all those plagues were going on in Egypt, when the Hebrews were protected, I'm just curious how the Egyptians experienced darkness where it says you can't even see your hand.
Yeah.
Or it felt like a darkness that can be felt. It's described real descriptive.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But then how do they live in light in Goshen? How do they, where does the darkness end and the light?
Well, don't ask me.
But it just always made me wonder that.
I hope that when we get to heaven, that we're going to be able to see a replay of all of that.
Sure.
I would love to revisit that and see how it was done.
Yeah.
I mean, not that God. I don't. It's not like trying to understand technology. It's just like this great power that God has. He doesn't manipulate things or whatever. He speaks and they are.
Mm-hmm.
But I would just like to see that.
Mm-hmm.
I really would. But I love what he said too. What are you going to take here that, can't these signs be figurative, and can't the events be real? I mean, people just turn the scripture upside down to me.
Sure.
When they get to eschatology, and the way Bo presented this, I thought was just the best and most natural way to interpret the passage.
Yeah. Well, let's go. I know you were trying to stick to the more. Real things here, more physical things, but as we get into 30, they speak of the sign of the Son of Man appearing in the sky, and then all the tribes of the earth mourning. So what's the sign, Bo? Let me know, and I guess as a follow-up, why are they mourning?
Yeah, well, I think, to me, if it is all going to be true that these things occurred for that generation.
Well, I mean, if you think it's symbolic, then let me know. I'm not trying to lead you either way on this.
Yeah, I think it is symbolic to a degree, because I don't know that we have firsthand accounts of people literally seeing Jesus or the angels coming with him in appearance. But I think that is a way that is described kind of consistently in the Bible, that a time of judgment is a day of the Lord. And I think you can interpret his coming to be in judgment, maybe not in appearance to a degree, but in judgment. So I don't know, I'd be interested to hear.
I think that the judgment had to happen, but before the parousia can happen. Before Jesus returns, the judgment has to happen.
Yeah.
I just go back to what he said to the council and the priests when he was on trial.
Mm-hmm.
This very same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that there are different applications. And another thing that Bo talked about in the Old Testament, you have a telescopic prophecy.
Mm-hmm.
Most prophecies are telescopic.
Yeah.
There's the near fulfillment.
Yep.
And the far fulfillment.
Sure.
Why can't this have more than one fulfillment?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, and that's really, what I'm thinking.
The near fulfillment gives credibility to the far fulfillment. So,
absolutely.
Especially for people like us who are sitting here this side of 70 AD.
What you say is so right on there, because think about it like this. Jesus prophesies clearly here. Mm-hmm. I mean, you can say, I know what the liberal scholars do. They go back and say this was written after 70 A.D., written by the church. But
sure.
Let's just say that the plain reading in the history of the church that this was written before 70 A.D.
Sure.
Then you have this amazing prophecy by Jesus that these stones that these disciples are saying, Lord, how can this be? Mm-hmm. And Jesus says, what do you mean, how can it be? I'm telling you, it's going to be completely destroyed.
Yeah.
That is remarkable prophecy. So if that comes true, then why should we doubt the other? And I think that both said this, so I know you did because you quoted Sproul. You have the question here, either Jesus doesn't know what he's talking about,
yeah,
or he is the Son of God.
Mm-hmm.
I think he's the Son of God. I think that's clear.
Sure.
Can I ask you then, as far as verse 30 goes, the appearance of the Son of Man, what would you say that Jesus is describing to his disciples then?
I think it could be the ascension. We're talking about near prophecy. I think it can be the ascension. I think it can be in the judgment of Israel in 70 A.D., and I think it can be the parousia. I don't think it has to be either or. I think he's going to come in a series of just what you said. The Bible talks about in the Old Testament the day of the Lord. Well, we know that the cosmic day of the Lord, the ultimate day of the Lord, is the second coming of Jesus. But there have been temporal judgments throughout, and I think that there can also be this epiphany of the glory of Christ in different stages too. That is the way I look at it, Bo. And I find that kind of consistent with the way you unpack the passage.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, that ultimately you did. I think throughout your whole sermon, you pointed to a near fulfillment and a far fulfillment, and like you already mentioned, Kenny, there could be multiple fulfillments leading to the ultimate fulfillment. I think it's all very useful in light of things to come, and it should be encouraging as you face certain situations.
If it were only history, then okay.
Yeah, there's still use, but it's not.
It's still useful because we see the glory of Christ. But if there are stages of this, then we do live, and Bo made this clear, we do live with a sense of urgency and a sense of what Peter says, therefore what kind of man ought you to be. Exactly.
So the fig tree, verse 32, what is he telling us there with the parable of the fig tree? And, when its branches have become tender and puts forth its leaves, the summer is near. Just to be looking for these signs he's already been mentioning. And
right, he goes through, a lot of verses obviously describing signs, and whether it's the imminent or a sign of his imminent return, or just, description of the general nature of things when judgment is coming, that you just need to recognize the sign of the times, or the signs of the times, just to be aware.
Yeah. And then as our last question, our last full question, let's talk about the generation. So here in 35, it says, heaven and earth will pass away, but actually, you know what? I don't know why I put that according to verse 35 there, but 34. Yeah, there it is, 34. This generation will not pass away until all these things take place. So, and that you spoke of throughout your sermon, and obviously the commentaries on this, there's a little bit of variance in them, but what are your thoughts on what this generation means? Is it literally the generation he's talking to? Is it, I think you mentioned also a type and group of people you kind of mentioned, and then I've also in one view also heard that the generation could also be the generation that he's speaking of these future events happening to. So where do you, just remind us where you stand?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of it all, I'm more persuaded that the natural language of that he's talking to his contemporaries, that during their lives' all these things would take place to some degree.
They'll see a near fulfillment of it.
Right. I mean, and I could, I mean, that's what I'm more persuaded as to, but I know some reputable scholars and preachers hold differing views, and I'm not certainly opposed to that, but it seems to be more natural in his use of that, just the course of the discourse. But also it's still consistent with when we looked at Matthew, was it 16, where he kind of gives similar language, but he didn't use the word generation. He just specifically says some of those living, or some of you here will not taste death until you see this. So it seems to be a little bit more consistent with that.
16:28.
Kenny, your thoughts on this generation?
I agree with Bo. I think it's that generation. I mean, if 23:36, truly I say to you, all these things will come from this generation, talking about the woes to the Pharisees.
Yes.
If that doesn't sway the argument, then I don't know what can, as far as context. When you interpret Scripture, you have to interpret one of the basic rules for interpreting Scripture is context. Context here, it's clear that generation means those who were living at that time.
Yeah.
So again, I know that there are different views on that, and with Bo, I respect the people who hold them. And if I'm wrong, then when we get to heaven, I will gladly say, "Hey, I missed that." It will not be the only thing I probably missed. But,
well, yeah, likewise.
Yeah, but I don't think so, because it's just the natural reading of the passage.
So as you guys were going through this, each of you doing your prep for this session, you obviously probably preparing for much longer than we were. What stood out to you in a different way or for the first time as you did study?
Well, I have read the Bible, so therefore I've read this before, but I have not, as I indicated in the beginning of the message, really just studied it to the extent that I felt like I needed to have a position.
Yeah.
When I listened to folks, and I'm like, yes, that's pretty persuasive, or no, that just doesn't make sense to me. But then if I'm going to speak on something, I think it's responsible to let folks know there's other legitimate views, but then say what your ultimate persuasion is. But anyway, when I did all that and looking at the numerous references that and really, I think most of them were in Matthew, where he refers to the coming of the Son of Man, and it doesn't seem like he's talking about the second coming.
Yeah.
And that just made it a little bit easier for me to be persuaded that he's talking about 70 AD. I was kind of leaned more in that direction before, but then just to have literal passages that you read and study that seem to indicate to support that thought or that conclusion.
Kenny, anything stand out to you?
Well, like Bo, my thoughts on eschatology, the study of end times, has changed through the years, and I studied this time. I can't say that I changed my mind much on anything. I just sharpened, my thoughts on, especially the stages. I knew that Bo and I had a slight disagreement on some of the timing of this.
Okay.
That's one of the reasons I asked him to speak on it. And
what's that slight disagreement?
I think Bo thinks that, or believes, whatever, has come to the conclusion that most of this is written before 70 AD, and 70 AD is kind of the culmination.
Yeah.
I take a little bit later view of the book of Revelation, and I think that this is partially all in fulfillment, but that there's some parts of it that are not. And that was why I think it was really good for him to preach on the first part of this chapter. You said something. You said you see how much Kenny thinks of Bo to
Sure.
give him this passage. You said that
Well,
Sunday
I meant
morning.
it.
Yeah, and I said, you know what? He has got it perfectly. Because I respect his view. I respect what he did. And I was thinking throughout this whole thing, for those of you on Facebook who are watching this, this is probably different than many of you are used to hearing as we've talked about this passage. And I would encourage you to, if you didn't get to listen to Bo's sermon Sunday morning, even if you did, go back and listen to it again. And it'll take a few times, I think, to unpack it. And I think we've done a good job tonight of kind of clarifying some of the things he said and going deeper on the things he said. But this would be worthwhile for you to do. And encourage others to watch it as well. People that maybe you talk about end times because, we live in such unusual times right now. And so perhaps this will be a good lesson. It's a good lesson, too, that when you live in unusual times, that you can always know that no matter what happens, no matter what the tribulation is, that God is going to persevere his elect until the end, and that God is in control. And as Jesus prophesied what would happen, he knows what's going to happen tomorrow. So I think all of us can take great confidence in that. And as Peter said again, we should, knowing these things, what manner of men and women should we be?
So how's this going to tie into the next section of the Olivet Discourse for your sermon series here? Are you going to continue on, or are you going to?
I'm going to overlap just a couple of verses
Sure.
to go into the fig tree. We didn't talk much about the fig tree.
Yeah.
So I'll talk a little bit more about the fig tree, and there's going to be some overlap because, in the partial view that I hold, it's called partial preterist, there is some room for end times in this. And
Yeah.
I think some of it's clear, but then I'm going to just weave in what he said because what he preached Sunday, I'm telling you, I have absolute agreement with. I can't see it any other way myself.
Well, great.
And thank you, Bo, because that was a big job unpacking all that, and he did a great job.
Certainly a tough one.
Yeah, it was a tough one.
Well, I appreciated watching you with Dee Dee for the last 2 weeks, but I certainly enjoyed it more being here myself.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun.
Enjoy it, and I always enjoy your preaching, Bo, so thank you for that.
Yep,
it's a
me
blessing
too.
to me and
too.
to the church.
Yep.
Kenny, would you mind closing us in a word of prayer?
Father, I thank you for these men who are here tonight and for their love for you, and because they love you so much, they love your word. And Lord, I pray that for all who are here and for those who will be watching online, that this will be very helpful to them as they think about, Lord, that you are sovereign and that prophecy is fulfilled in your time and in your ways because you are in control of all things, and you will keep us through whatever comes. You will keep us in your hands, and nothing will ever pluck us out of your hands. And we are so thankful for this and encouraged. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.